Married for 10 years, my husband never once laid a finger on me. Then one rainy afternoon, he left me $400 million and jumped from a rooftop. 7 days later, a stranger handed me a sealed letter that changed everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. My name is Diana, and for a decade I was the quiet, obedient wife of Weston Hale, heir to one of the largest holding companies on the East Coast. At his funeral, I stood in 3-inch heels for hours accepting condolences with dry eyes. Not because I felt nothing, but because I had cried myself empty years earlier in that cold, silent marriage. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, sat nearby dabbing at tears for the cameras, then hissed at me the moment guests looked away, calling me a cursed, barren failure who had driven her son to his grave. My sister-in-law, Paisley, barely looked up from her phone, muttering that I was probably already counting the money I hoped to inherit. Days later, the family lawyer arrived to read the will, and the room went silent when he announced that every share, every property, and every trust, worth roughly $400 million, belonged entirely to me, Weston's legal wife. Eleanor lunged for the document, screaming that I must have tricked him, while Paisley charged at me, shrieking about stolen family money. I sat frozen, absorbing the shock of a decade spent as a silent shadow in that mansion, suddenly becoming the sole heir to an empire. On the 7th day after the funeral, while Eleanor banned me from even walking upstairs to Weston's memorial candles, a strange man in a black coat appeared at the gate with a sealed envelope. He introduced himself as Preston, a private attorney Weston had hired secretly years earlier, instructed to deliver this letter to me at exactly 7 that evening, not a moment sooner. I locked myself in my room and opened it with shaking hands, recognizing Weston's familiar handwriting immediately, though the tone was nothing like the cold notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter. He wrote that he had known for years about the sharp, brilliant financial strategist I used to be before our marriage, a woman who once ruled trading floors under a reputation nobody in this new life ever knew about. Then came the confession that broke my heart wide open, that he suffered from a rare medical condition that meant he could never be intimate with a wife, and that our entire marriage had been a carefully built cover story to protect the family image and secure his position as heir. He called the inheritance compensation for the years he had stolen from me, and told me there was a hidden safe behind our wedding portrait containing a black ledger documenting every fraudulent transaction Eleanor, Paisley, and the executives around them had committed for years. I found the safe exactly where he said, opened it with the date of our first meeting, and inside sat that leather ledger along with a drive full of evidence. That night I burned his letter on the balcony, poured his finest scotch, and drank it alone for the first time in 10 years, feeling the timid, obedient woman I had been slowly dissolve into something sharper and far more dangerous. Eleanor kicked open my bedroom door that same night with a spare key, furious to find me drinking instead of mourning, and threatened to destroy my reputation with fabricated affair rumors unless I signed everything over to Paisley within 3 days. For the first time in a decade, I did not flinch. I told her calmly that this house now belonged to me, and that she needed to leave my room immediately. Watching her stunned silence as she realized the timid wife she had abused for 10 years was gone for good. The next morning I burned every drab, matronly outfit Eleanor had forced me to wear, pulled a sharp tailored suit from a box I had hidden for years, and walked into the family dining room to claim the seat at the head of the table that had always belonged to Weston or his mother. I informed Eleanor plainly that she now had hands of her own to fetch her breakfast. Because I was no longer the maid of this house, I was the chairman of the board, and I drove into Manhattan that same morning to reclaim control of the company from executives who assumed a grieving widow would be too weak to notice them looting it. I walked straight into an emergency board meeting, where the chief financial officer, Holden, was openly plotting to funnel company assets into shell accounts before I could understand what was happening. I slammed the will and my ownership documents onto the table, took the chairman's seat myself, and calmly dismantled his cover story question by question until the entire room understood exactly who they were dealing with. Within days, I had also caught the operations VP, Trevor, hiding an affair that had quietly sabotaged a major development project, and used the leverage to force him back into line without mercy. That same evening, I came home to find Eleanor and Paisley tearing my bedroom apart with shears, screaming that I must be hiding stolen valuables. So I calmly recorded the entire scene and called the police myself, watching Eleanor's fury curdle into genuine fear for the first time in 10 years. From there, the war escalated fast. A smear campaign painting me as a gold-digging black widow flooded the tabloids. Company stock crashed, and factory workers nearly rioted over false rumors that I planned to liquidate everything and disappear. I held a press conference and laid the truth out in cold, hard numbers instead of tears, showing the exact accounts Eleanor and Paisley had drained over the years, and announcing that every dollar of profit would go toward protecting employee jobs rather than my own pocket. The narrative flipped overnight. The stock recovered, and Eleanor, cornered and desperate, staged a dramatic hospital collapse for sympathy, though I knew from Weston's ledger her health was fine and her tears were pure performance. I visited her anyway, and quietly reminded her that I knew the real story behind her own husband's decades-old car accident. A truth she never expected me to hold over her, and she never tried a public stunt again. Just as one crisis settled, a smooth investor named Lance offered a massive capital injection to save the company. But my old contacts revealed his firm was secretly funded by a ruthless corporate raider named Damon Vale, working with Eleanor to sell off the company from underneath me for her own payout. I drove upstate through pouring rain to beg a loyal former operations chief Higgins out of retirement, standing outside his cabin for hours until he finally agreed to help me rebuild trust with the factory floor before Damon's people could incite a riot among the frightened workers. Paisley, humiliated and desperate after her mother's schemes kept failing, dragged me into family court trying to annul the will entirely, claiming our sexless, decade-long marriage proved I had manipulated a vulnerable man. I placed Weston's private medical diagnosis on the table in front of her, forcing her to finally understand the devastating secret he had carried silently his entire life, and she withdrew the lawsuit in stunned, tearful silence rather than let the truth become a public spectacle. Meanwhile, Holden, facing prison for his failed embezzlement scheme, tried to sell stolen company data to Damon Vale for a plane ticket out of the country. But I had the meeting tracked and the police waiting, and he was arrested on the spot screaming that Eleanor had orchestrated the entire theft from the beginning. Cornered with nowhere left to run, Eleanor finally came to me on her knees, begging me not to press further charges, and I agreed only if she signed the mansion over to help repay what she had stolen from the company, watching a decade of quiet cruelty finally collapse into total defeat. Just when I thought the war was over, I found a hidden recording in Weston's old office revealing that Damon Vale had blackmailed him for years over his private condition, threatening public humiliation unless he handed over $1 billion project. And that threat, not simple despair, was what finally pushed my husband off that ledge. Grief turned instantly into cold fury, and when Damon later kidnapped Paisley to force my hand, I walked into his warehouse alone wearing a hidden wire, stalled him into confessing everything on tape, and watched police storm the building the moment he admitted what he had done to Weston. In the aftermath, I fired every executive who had helped loot the company, promoted the loyal employees who had been overlooked for years, and quietly gave Paisley a real second chance on the factory floor after she tearfully returned the jewelry she had once stolen from me. I used my own money, not the company's, to build a foundation supporting children born with the same rare condition Weston hid his entire life, wanting no other family to carry that shame in silence the way he had. Months later, a prestigious firm in London offered me the international career I had dreamed of before my marriage swallowed my 20s, and for days I genuinely considered leaving all of it, the mansion, the company, the memories, behind for good. Standing on the office rooftop one evening, looking out over the employees who now trusted me, the factory workers Higgins had brought back to life, and the family I had rebuilt from wreckage, I finally understood that real freedom was not running away. It was standing firm on the ground I had fought so hard to reclaim, and I turned the offer down. A year after Weston's death, I drove out to the coast alone at sunrise, slipped off my shoes, and walked barefoot into the cold surf, letting the tide wash away the last decade of silence and grief. Standing there with the sun rising over the water, I finally slid off my wedding ring and let it go, understanding that the timid, obedient woman who once wore it had been gone for a long time, and in her place stood someone who had rebuilt an entire empire, and herself, out of nothing but ashes. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it down, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because Revenge Tales has a lot more stories just like this one coming your way, and you do not want to miss what happens next.